You are told to wait, wait for opportunity, wait for growth, wait for stability, wait for tomorrow. But ask yourselves, who benefits from your waiting? Who grows rich while you grow tired? Who accumulates power while you are instructed to remain patient, obedient, and silent? Patience under capitalism is not a virtue. It is a weapon, aimed directly at the working class. From the earliest days of class society, those who own the means of production have understood a simple truth. An oppressed people who believe their suffering is temporary will endure far more exploitation than a people who recognize it as structural. Capital does not merely exploit labor, it disciplines it, and one of its most effective tools of discipline is the promise that endurance will be rewarded. You are told that hardship is natural, that inequality is inevitable, that sacrifice today will bring freedom tomorrow. Yet tomorrow never arrives. Wages stagnate, hours lengthen, costs rise, and still you are told to be patient. This patience is not neutral. It is carefully cultivated. It is taught in schools, preached in workplaces, glorified in culture. It becomes a moral duty for the poor and a strategic advantage for the rich. Capital thrives on delay. Every moment you wait is a moment surplus value is extracted from your labor. Every year you postpone resistance is a year profits accumulate in the hands of a few. The system does not fear your exhaustion, it depends on it. A worker too tired to organize is a worker easy to control. Capitalism presents exploitation as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. It tells the worker, work harder, wait longer, and one day you may escape your class. In this way, it isolates individuals, transforming collective suffering into private failure. When you struggle, you are told it is because you did not wait enough, did not sacrifice enough, did not believe enough. This is how patience becomes ideological. It teaches the oppressed to internalize blame while externalizing hope. It dissolves anger into resignation and replaces solidarity with competition. Workers are pitted against one another, each waiting for their turn to rise, while the structure that keeps them down remains untouched. But history exposes this lie. No ruling class has ever relinquished power because the oppressed waited politely. No system of exploitation has collapsed from patience alone. Progress has never been granted. It has been seized. Every right enjoyed by workers was won through struggle, organization, and collective force, not through silent endurance. Capital understands this better than the workers themselves. That is why it fears consciousness more than rebellion, organization more than anger. An angry worker may explode alone, a conscious class moves together. And patience, when weaponized, delays consciousness. It teaches workers to normalize injustice, to treat exploitation as the price of survival rather than as a condition to be abolished. Look around you. You live in an age of unprecedented productive capacity, where abundance is possible for all, and yet scarcity is manufactured, unemployment is maintained, insecurity is normalized. Why? Because a population kept in constant uncertainty is easier to govern. A worker, afraid of losing tomorrow, will accept exploitation today. Capital does not merely control factories and offices, it controls time itself. It steals your hours, your energy, your future, and then asks you to wait for compensation that never comes. Your patience fuels its accumulation. Your silence protects its dominance. But patience has a limit, and when it breaks, it transforms into something far more powerful than resignation, collective action. The working class is not powerless. It is rendered powerless by division and delay. Once workers recognize themselves not as isolated individuals, but as a class bound by shared conditions, the illusion collapses. The same labor that produces wealth can withhold it. The same hands that build society can reshape it. Organization is the antidote to imposed patience. Solidarity is the refusal to wait alone. Class consciousness is the moment when suffering ceases to be endured privately and is instead confronted collectively. When workers organize, patience is no longer submission. It becomes strategy, discipline, preparation for transformation. Capital will warn you against this. It will call organization unrealistic, dangerous, premature. It will insist that now is not the right time. But there is never a right time for the ruling class to lose power. Delay is always in its interest. Urgency belongs to the oppressed. The task before you is not to wait for justice, but to build it. Not to hope for reform, but to demand transformation. Not to endure exploitation, but to abolish the conditions that produce it. History moves through struggle. Society advances through conflict between classes with opposing interests. To deny this is to deny reality itself. Capital and labor are not partners, they are antagonists. One lives by appropriating, the other by producing. As long as this contradiction exists, patience will be demanded of one class and profits enjoyed by the other. The future will not be given to those who wait. It will be claimed by those who organize. Workers of the world, recognize the weapon turned against you. Disarm it. Replace patience with solidarity, resignation with resistance, isolation with unity. The power you are told to wait for already exists. In your labor, your numbers, your collective will, history does not belong to the patient, it belongs to the organized. Patience under capitalism is presented as a moral ideal, a sign of maturity and responsibility, yet in reality it functions as a mechanism of control that disciplines the working class and neutralizes resistance. From an early age, individuals are taught that enduring hardship quietly is noble, that waiting for improvement is wiser than demanding change, and that suffering is a temporary phase on the path to success. This narrative does not emerge accidentally. It is produced and reinforced by a system that depends on prolonged submission to maintain its dominance. Patience becomes a psychological contract imposed on workers, persuading them to tolerate conditions that would otherwise be recognized as intolerable. Capitalism requires stability in exploitation. Profits rely on predictable labor, disciplined bodies, and managed expectations. When workers are patient, they accept low wages with the belief that raises will come later, endure long hours with the promise of future security, and tolerate injustice in the hope of eventual reward. This waiting period is not passive, it is productive for capital. During every moment of endurance, surplus value is extracted, accumulated, and centralized. The longer workers wait, the stronger capital becomes, and the weaker collective resistance grows. Patience also serves to individualize suffering. When exploitation is framed as something to be endured temporarily, failure to escape it is blamed on personal shortcomings rather than structural conditions. Workers are told that if they remain poor, insecure, or exhausted, it is because they did not wait long enough, work hard enough, or sacrifice enough. This transforms systemic violence into private guilt. Instead of questioning the system that produces inequality, individuals turn inward, internalizing blame while continuing to participate in their own exploitation. The ideology of patience suppresses anger by redefining it as immaturity or irresponsibility. Outrage at injustice is dismissed as impatience, while compliance is praised as wisdom. In this way, emotional responses that could lead to collective action are delegitimized. A patient worker is seen as rational, an impatient worker is portrayed as dangerous. This moral framing protects existing power relations by discouraging dissent and isolating those who refuse to wait. The system rewards obedience not with liberation but with survival. Capitalist time is asymmetrical. For the ruling class, time accumulates wealth, interest, and power. For the working class, time is consumed through labor, stress, and insecurity. Yet workers are told that time is on their side, that progress is inevitable if they simply endure. This illusion masks the reality that waiting does not alter the fundamental relation between labor and capital. Ownership remains concentrated, decision-making remains centralized, and exploitation continues uninterrupted while patience delays confrontation. Patience also fragments the working class by encouraging competition over solidarity. Each worker is told to wait for their individual breakthrough rather than organize for collective change. Hope is privatized while struggle is postponed. This creates a population of isolated individuals enduring similar conditions but experiencing them as personal journeys rather than shared realities. Capital benefits from this fragmentation because a divided class cannot act as a unified force. Historically, patience has never dismantled systems of domination. Feudalism did not collapse because peasants waited politely, nor were labor rights granted because workers trusted in the goodwill of employers. Every material improvement won by the working class emerged from disruption, refusal, and organized struggle. Capitalism obscures this history because remembering it would expose patience as submission rather than virtue. The ruling class prefers narratives of gradual improvement that conceal the conflicts through which change actually occurs. The demand for patience is always directed downward. Those who possess power are never asked to wait for profit, influence, or security. They act decisively to protect their interests, restructure economies, and suppress threats. Only the oppressed are told that waiting is ethical, necessary, and realistic. This asymmetry reveals patience as a class-based expectation imposed on those without power to keep them from recognizing their collective strength. When patience is normalized, exploitation becomes invisible. Injustice that persists over time is accepted as natural, and conditions that should provoke resistance are treated as permanent features of life. This normalization dulls consciousness and transforms survival into the highest aspiration. Workers begin to measure success, not by freedom or dignity, but by their ability to endure without collapse, adjusting their expectations downward while capital's demands continue to rise. The transformation of patience into a weapon lies in its ability to delay awakening. As long as workers believe that waiting will bring relief, they postpone organization. As long as they believe endurance is virtuous, they suppress the impulse to resist. As long as they believe the system can reward them individually, they refrain from challenging it collectively. In this suspended state, exploitation continues smoothly, accumulation accelerates, and power remains untouched, while generations of workers pass through the same cycle of hope, endurance, and exhaustion, each taught to wait a little longer, to trust a little more, to sacrifice a little further, even as the conditions of their lives remain fundamentally unchanged. Bound to a system that converts their time, patience, and labor into instruments of its own preservation. Capital profits not only from the labor of workers, but from the conditions that weaken their ability to resist, and among these conditions, delay, exhaustion, and resignation are the most effective. The capitalist system is structured to extend time in favor of accumulation while compressing life for those who labor within it. Every delay in resistance allows profits to grow uninterrupted. Every exhausted worker becomes less capable of organization, and every act of resignation reinforces the stability of exploitation. These are not accidental outcomes, but central mechanisms through which capital maintains its dominance. Delay functions as a strategic advantage for capital because it transforms urgent injustice into a distant concern. Workers are encouraged to believe that conditions will improve gradually, that reforms are coming, and that now is not the right moment to act. This postponement is endlessly renewed. There is always another quarter, another election, another policy discussion, another promise of change. While workers wait, capital continues its extraction without interruption. Delay stretches suffering across time, making it bearable enough to endure but never resolved enough to disappear. Exhaustion is the physical and psychological outcome of prolonged exploitation. Long working hours, precarious employment, constant surveillance, and economic insecurity drain energy not only from the body but from the mind. An exhausted worker struggles to imagine alternatives, let alone fight for them. Fatigue narrows vision, reducing life to survival. When workers are consumed by the effort to maintain basic stability, they have little capacity left for collective thought, organization, or resistance. Capital depends on this exhaustion because it produces compliance without the need for constant force. The modern workplace is designed to maximize this depletion. Productivity targets rise, breaks shrink, and boundaries between work and personal life dissolve. Technology, rather than freeing labor, extends work into every hour of the day. Workers remain connected, available, and anxious even when unpaid. This continuous pressure creates a state of permanent alertness, where rest is insufficient and recovery is incomplete. Exhaustion becomes normalized, treated as a personal weakness rather than a systemic condition imposed by the demands of profit. Resignation emerges when delay and exhaustion converge. After years of waiting and depletion, workers begin to accept their conditions as unchangeable. Hope shifts from collective transformation to individual coping. People lower their expectations, adjusting to insecurity and inequality as if they were natural features of existence. Resignation is not passive. It is actively produced through repeated disappointment, broken promises, and the absence of meaningful change. Capital relies on this psychological surrender because a resigned workforce polices itself. When resignation sets in, exploitation no longer requires justification. Workers may recognize injustice, but they no longer believe resistance is possible. Cynicism replaces anger, and survival replaces dignity. This is the ideal condition for capital, where domination is maintained not through repression, but through acts. The system appears inevitable, and alternatives seem unrealistic. In this state, even suffering loses its political meaning and becomes merely a personal burden to be managed privately. Capital also profits from turning exhaustion and resignation into competitive advantages. Workers are encouraged to endure more than others, to accept worse conditions to secure employment, to prove their worth through sacrifice. This competition deepens exhaustion while preventing solidarity. Each worker fears falling behind, making them more willing to tolerate exploitation and less willing to resist collectively. Capital benefits from this fragmentation because it transforms shared oppression into individualized struggle. Delay, exhaustion, and resignation also distort time itself. For workers, time is experienced as pressure and scarcity, always running out, always insufficient. For capital, time accumulates power, interest, and leverage. The longer workers endure without resistance, the more entrenched capital becomes. Investments grow, institutions solidify, and narratives of inevitability strengthen. By the time resistance feels possible, the system appears too large to challenge, reinforcing resignation even further. Historical experience reveals that capital's greatest victories occur not when it defeats rebellion directly, but when it prevents rebellion from emerging at all. Exhausted workers rarely organize. Resigned workers rarely imagine alternatives. Delayed struggles lose momentum before they begin. This quiet suppression is more effective than overt violence because it operates invisibly, embedded in everyday life. People continue to work, produce, and consume while their capacity to resist erodes gradually. The profitability of delay, exhaustion, and resignation lies in their self-reinforcing nature. Delay produces exhaustion, exhaustion produces resignation, and resignation justifies further delay. This cycle sustains exploitation without requiring constant coercion. Workers remain trapped not because they are unaware, but because their conditions leave them with neither the time nor the energy to act collectively. Capital converts their fatigue into stability and their resignation into consent, securing its dominance by ensuring that resistance is always postponed, always weakened, always deferred, while accumulation continues uninterrupted and the structures of power grow more deeply rooted in every aspect of social life. Exploitation is not an accident of poor management, economic downturns, or individual shortcomings. It is a structural feature of capitalism itself, embedded in the very relations that define how production and wealth are organized. To treat exploitation as temporary is to misunderstand its purpose, and to frame it as individual failure is to conceal the system that produces it. Capitalism depends on the extraction of surplus value from labor, and this extraction is not a deviation from the system's logic, but its foundation. As long as the means of production are privately owned and labor is sold as a commodity, exploitation is not a passing condition but a permanent one. The system presents exploitation as a transitional phase, something workers must endure before advancement becomes possible. People are told that struggle is a stepping stone, that hardship is the price of progress, and that perseverance will eventually lead to stability or success. This narrative transforms structural inequality into a personal journey, isolating individuals within their own suffering. When improvement does not arrive, the blame is redirected inward. Workers are encouraged to believe they did not try hard enough, adapt enough, or sacrifice enough, rather than questioning the system that profits from their endurance. Capitalism individualizes outcomes while collectivizing exploitation. Millions may experience the same insecurity, stagnating wages, and declining living standards, yet each is encouraged to interpret these conditions as personal circumstances. This fragmentation prevents the recognition of shared structural constraints. The worker who struggles is told to improve themselves rather than challenge the relations that govern their labor. Education, discipline, and resilience are promoted as solutions, while ownership, power, and control remain untouched. Exploitation persists even when productivity increases. Technological advancement and higher output do not liberate workers, they intensify extraction. As productivity rises, expectations rise with it, and the benefits are concentrated in the hands of owners rather than distributed to those who produce the wealth. This demonstrates that exploitation is not caused by inefficiency or scarcity, but by the social relations that determine who controls surplus. The system can generate abundance and still maintain deprivation because inequality is structurally necessary for capital accumulation. The concept of merit functions as a powerful ideological shield for exploitation. By framing success as the result of individual talent and effort, capitalism disguises the structural barriers that shape outcomes. Those who rise are portrayed as deserving, while those who remain exploited are portrayed as lacking. This moral hierarchy legitimizes inequality and discourages solidarity. Workers begin to measure themselves against one another, instead of recognizing their shared position within a system that systematically advantages owners over labor. Exploitation is reproduced through institutions that appear neutral. Labor markets, contracts, wages, and legal frameworks are presented as fair exchanges between equals, yet they operate within conditions where one side owns the means of survival and the other must sell its labor to live. This imbalance is structural, not personal. Workers do not freely choose exploitation, they are compelled by material necessity. The appearance of choice conceals the reality of coercion embedded in economic relations. Crises further expose the structural nature of exploitation. During economic downturns, Workers are expected to accept layoffs, wage cuts, and insecurity to preserve profitability. Losses are socialized while gains remain private. This recurring pattern reveals that exploitation intensifies when capital is threatened, confirming that worker sacrifice is not an emergency measure, but an expected response. The system adjusts, but always in ways that protect ownership rather than labor. Capitalism also relies on generational continuity of exploitation. Children inherit not only economic conditions but class positions. Access to education, healthcare, and stability is unevenly distributed, ensuring that exploitation reproduces itself across time. This persistence undermines the idea that inequality is temporary or solvable through individual effort alone. If exploitation were accidental, it would dissipate as societies develop. Instead, it adapts and deepens. The framing of exploitation as individual failure serves a crucial political function. It disarms collective resistance by turning systemic critique into self-doubt. Workers exhausted by precarity blame themselves rather than the structures that impose it. Shame replaces anger, and isolation replaces solidarity. This psychological internalization of structural violence is one of capitalism's most effective tools. To recognize exploitation as structural is to reclaim clarity. It reveals that the problem does not lie in the character of workers, but in the organization of society. It shifts the focus from self-improvement to collective transformation, from private struggle to shared conditions. Once exploitation is understood as a systemic relation rather than a personal flaw, the possibility of resistance emerges not as an individual ambition but as a collective necessity, rooted in the recognition that as long as labor is subordinated to capital, exploitation will remain a defining feature of everyday life, shaping work, insecurity, inequality, and power across generations and across all forms of production within the existing social order. Class consciousness emerges when individuals recognize that their personal struggles are not isolated experiences but expressions of a shared condition rooted in material relations. Under capitalism, waiting is imposed as a discipline, teaching workers to endure injustice individually while hoping for private relief. Class consciousness erupts this imposed patience by revealing its true function. It exposes waiting not as a neutral pause, but as a strategy that benefits capital by delaying resistance. Once workers see themselves as part of a collective bound by the same structures of exploitation, waiting loses its passive character and becomes a site of potential action. Without class consciousness, waiting fragments the working class. Each person waits alone, believing their suffering is unique or temporary. Hope is individualized, and expectations are privatized. People wait for promotion, stability, recognition, or escape, imagining a personal exit from conditions that remain unchanged for the majority. This isolation weakens resistance because it prevents the recognition of shared interests. Class consciousness dissolves this isolation by naming the common source of hardship, transforming private endurance into shared awareness. When workers understand their position as a class, waiting no longer signifies submission. It becomes strategic rather than imposed. Conscious workers do not wait for permission or benevolence. They wait to organize, to coordinate, to build power collectively. This shift is decisive. Capital relies on unconscious waiting, on delay that drains energy and hope. Class consciousness converts time from an instrument of domination into a resource for preparation, allowing resistance to develop with intention rather than desperation. The transformation begins with recognition. Workers come to see that their labor produces wealth they do not control, that insecurity is not a personal failure, and that inequality is not accidental. This recognition alters perception itself. Everyday experiences of work, fatigue, and precarity acquire political meaning. What once appeared as individual misfortune is understood as systemic exploitation. Waiting under these conditions is no longer filled with false hope, but with growing clarity about the necessity of change. Class consciousness also reorients emotions. Fear, shame, and resignation are replaced by solidarity and shared purpose. Waiting ceases to be lonely because it is no longer endured in silence. Communication spreads, experiences are compared, and patterns become visible. As understanding deepens, patience imposed from above is rejected, and discipline generated from within the class takes its place. This discipline is not obedience, but coordination, the ability to act together rather than react separately. Collective resistance does not emerge spontaneously, it is built through conscious effort. Class consciousness provides the foundation for this effort by aligning individual grievances with collective goals. Workers begin to see that what harms one harms all, and that what benefits one through competition weakens the class as a whole. Waiting, in this context, is no longer about postponing struggle, but about synchronizing it. The timing of resistance becomes a collective decision rather than an individual hesitation. Capital fears this transformation because it undermines the effectiveness of delay. A conscious class cannot be endlessly postponed. Promises lose their power when their function is understood. Reforms offered to diffuse tension are measured against collective interests rather than individual gain. Waiting becomes conditional, purposeful, and limited, shaped by strategic calculation rather than imposed endurance. Class consciousness also bridges past and future. It connects present conditions to historical struggles, revealing that rights and improvements were never gifts but results of organized action. This historical awareness strengthens resistance by grounding it in continuity. Workers waiting together understand that they are part of a longer process of struggle, not isolated actors suspended in uncertainty. This perspective replaces despair with resolve and transforms waiting into preparation for action rather than acceptance of fate. As consciousness spreads, the rhythm of social life begins to shift. Conversations change, priorities realign, and expectations rise. Workers no longer wait for individual advancement, but for collective leverage. This shared anticipation generates momentum, even before overt action begins. Capital senses this shift and responds with attempts to divide, distract, or accelerate exhaustion, recognizing that once waiting is collectivized, its usefulness as a weapon diminishes rapidly. The power of class consciousness lies in its ability to convert time itself into a field of struggle. Waiting is no longer empty or paralyzing, it is filled with analysis, organization, and mutual support. Each delay imposed by capital is met with deeper coordination among workers. Each attempt to isolate is countered with solidarity. Through this process, waiting ceases to be a passive state and becomes an active condition in which resistance is cultivated, strength is accumulated, and the foundations of collective action are laid within the everyday experiences of labor, exploitation, and shared survival under a system that depends on keeping workers divided, uncertain, and suspended in endless anticipation. Organized workers hold the power to dismantle capitalist domination because the system itself is sustained by their labor, coordination, and compliance. Capital presents itself as autonomous and invincible, yet it cannot function without the collective activity of those who produce value. Factories do not operate, services do not run, and profits do not materialize through ownership alone. They depend entirely on organized human effort. When workers recognize this dependence and act together, the apparent strength of capital reveals its underlying fragility. Capitalist domination rests on the separation of workers from one another. Individuals experience exploitation daily, but in isolation this experience appears personal rather than political. Organization breaks this isolation by transforming scattered grievances into shared understanding. When workers organize, they no longer confront capital as individuals negotiating from weakness, but as a collective force capable of imposing limits. This shift alters the balance of power, not symbolically but materially, because capital's authority relies on uninterrupted production and predictable labor. The ruling class understands this danger clearly. That is why organization is discouraged, restricted, or co-opted wherever possible. Legal barriers, corporate narratives, and ideological attacks are deployed to portray collective action as unrealistic, disruptive, or obsolete. These efforts are not responses to chaos, but preemptive defenses against the potential power of organized labor. Capital tolerates individual dissent, but fears collective capacity, because organization transforms dissatisfaction into leverage. Workers possess power not because of moral claims, but because of their structural position. They occupy the point at which value is created. Organized workers can slow production, halt it, redirect it, or refuse it altogether. This capacity gives labor a force that no individual consumer choice or isolated protest can replicate. Capitalist domination persists only so long as workers remain divided, uncoordinated, or convinced that such power does not exist. Organization also changes consciousness. Through collective struggle, workers learn that their conditions are not immutable and that their dependence on capital is not natural. They discover that cooperation among themselves is more productive and secure than competition imposed by the market. This realization undermines the ideological foundations of capitalism, which rely on presenting hierarchy as inevitable and exploitation as necessary. Organized workers begin to imagine alternatives, not as abstract ideals, but as practical possibilities emerging from their own collective strength. The power of organization lies in its cumulative nature. Each act of coordination builds experience, trust, and confidence. Small victories demonstrate that resistance is possible, weakening resignation and expanding expectations. Capital's authority erodes not all at once, but through repeated confrontations that expose its reliance on worker compliance. Organization creates continuity, ensuring that struggles do not dissolve after moments of crisis, but contribute to a growing capacity for sustained challenge. Capitalist domination also depends on controlling social institutions beyond the workplace. Yet, organized workers can extend their influence into these spheres. Through collective action, they challenge laws, norms, and political structures that protect ownership over labor. While capital commands resources, organized workers command numbers, relationships, and the ability to disrupt normal functioning. This collective presence reshapes political reality by forcing power to respond rather than dictate. The notion that capital is too powerful to confront is itself a product of disorganization. When workers are fragmented, capital appears unified and overwhelming. When workers organize, the opposite becomes visible. Capital fractures into competing interests, vulnerabilities, and dependencies. Supply chains, financial systems, and administrative structures reveal points of weakness that organized labor can exploit. What once seemed permanent becomes contingent on cooperation that can be withdrawn. Organization also redefines discipline. Under capitalism, discipline is imposed from above through surveillance, precarity, and threat. In organized movements, discipline is generated collectively through shared goals and mutual accountability. This internal discipline strengthens resistance by replacing fear with commitment. Workers no longer act out of desperation, but with purpose, guided by collective strategy rather than individual survival. Historical experience demonstrates that every significant challenge to capitalist domination has emerged from organized labor. Even partial reforms, concessions and protections were not gifts but responses to organized pressure. Capita L adapts to survive, but adaptation does not eliminate its dependence on labor. This contradiction ensures that organized workers retain the capacity to challenge domination whenever coordination reaches sufficient scale and clarity. The power of organized workers does not lie in spontaneous rebellion, but in sustained collective action grounded in material reality. As organization deepens, workers begin to see themselves not as passive participants in an imposed system, but as active agents capable of reshaping social relations. Capital's dominance weakens as its legitimacy erodes and its operations face continuous challenge from those whose labor sustains it, revealing that the structures of exploitation persist, not because they are unbreakable, but because the collective power required to dismantle them has been fragmented, delayed, or denied despite existing in the very organization of work, production and shared dependence that binds workers together within the system they have the capacity to transform. The truth revealed throughout this speech is undeniable. Capitalism depends on the subjugation of labor, the manipulation of time, and the isolation of workers. Patience, delay, exhaustion, and resignation are not neutral experiences, but tools wielded to maintain domination and conceal the structural nature of exploitation. Yet within this system lies its own undoing. When workers recognize that their struggles are shared, when they develop class consciousness, and when they organize collectively, the instruments of control, patience, delay, and resignation are transformed into the very mechanisms of resistance. The labor that sustains capital is the same labor capable of dismantling it. History shows that no power can withstand the united force of those who produce its wealth once they act with awareness and solidarity. The future does not belong to those who endure quietly. It belongs to those who understand their strength, unite and seize the power that is already theirs, converting collective consciousness into collective action and turning oppression into liberation.